The word cut through the ballroom like the crack of something breaking. Security. Celeste Rayner didn't even look at me when she said it. She simply lifted her champagne glass and extended one finger in my direction. A lazy, casual gesture, the kind you use when pointing at something you want removed from your immediate environment without having to engage with it personally. Drag her out. The music faltered. Conversations died mid-sentence all across the room. 50 donors in formal wear turned simultaneously to locate the source of what they had just heard. Phones lifted. Eyes widened. My stomach dropped completely. Because the woman with the champagne glass and the pointed finger wasn't just a guest at this fundraiser. She was the executive director's wife. She moved through the Halstead Civic Foundation like she had personally built every wall of it. She collected authority the way some people collect jewelry. Not because she needed it, but because she liked the way it looked on her. And she had just told the security team to physically remove me from the foundation's largest fundraiser of the entire year. The same fundraiser I had spent 4 months building from the ground up. I could feel heat moving up my neck as the 2 security guards began walking across the ballroom floor in my direction. Celeste smirked. Some staff members forget their place, she announced to the room. A few guests laughed, the nervous, uncomfortable kind of laugh that people produce when they don't know what else to do with themselves. My fingers tightened around the event binder in my hands. The guards reached the center of the ballroom, and then they stopped. Both guards stood completely still in the middle of the dance floor. The entire room watched. One guard looked at the other. A brief, quiet exchange, the kind that happens between 2 people who have just received the same piece of information and are both recalculating at the same time. Then they both looked at Celeste. Then, at me. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of statement. Celeste's smirk didn't shift immediately. She was still holding her glass, still positioned with the posture of someone who had just given an order and was simply waiting for it to be carried out. She hadn't registered yet that something had changed. She was standing in the same ballroom she had walked through every previous foundation event. The one where her word carried weight because her husband's title carried weight. The one where staff looked at her carefully before answering her questions. The one where her instructions generally produced the intended results. She didn't know yet that this evening was different, that the meeting that morning had happened, that the board had made decisions she had not been informed of, that the building she believed she controlled had quietly shifted its chain of command while she was deciding which gown to wear. But I knew. I had known since the board president pulled me aside at 11 o'clock that morning. And this moment, the guard standing still, the room watching, Celeste still smiling, was not the beginning of the story. It was the ending, arriving right on schedule. My name is Paige Talbot, Operations Director for the Halstead Civic Foundation, an organization that managed 3 community arts programs, the Youth Education Grant Fund, and one of the most respected annual fundraising galas in the city. Operations Director is a title that sounds administrative when you say it at a dinner party. People nod politely and move on to more interesting-sounding job titles. They picture spreadsheets and scheduling software and someone who makes sure the coffee arrives on time. What the title actually means is this. Everything that happens inside the Halstead Foundation building runs through me. Security staffing and scheduling, vendor contracts and event logistics, access management for every restricted area, compliance with the Foundation's governance policies, communication between departments during events. The legal and liability framework that kept the organization protected during its public-facing functions. Every door that opened, every guard who was posted, every system that kept the building functional during a 400-person fundraiser, my department managed it. Celeste Rayner had decided, sometime in the year since her husband became executive director, that I was simply a well-organized member of the general staff. Someone who handled practical details so that more important people didn't have to think about them. She was wrong about that in a way that was about to become very visible to everyone in the room. The first time I met Celeste, she arrived at a board planning session uninvited. Not as a scheduled participant, not as a guest with a specific reason to be present. She simply appeared in the doorway of the boardroom 15 minutes after the meeting started, walked to the empty chair at the far end of the table, and sat down as though she had been on the agenda the whole time. Her husband, the executive director, glanced at her briefly and said nothing. The board members looked at one another. I was seated near the operations report materials I had prepared, watching this unfold. Celeste surveyed the room with the comfortable expression of someone who has entered a space and found it exactly as expected. Then she looked at me and said, "Your operations, right? Just make sure I'm looped in on everything going forward." "What specifically would you like to be looped in on?" I asked. She waved one hand gently. "Everything important." She didn't hold a foundation role. She had no clearance designation in our system. She had not been approved by the board for any operational involvement whatsoever. The governance framework was explicit about spousal non-involvement in daily operations, but she said it with the certainty of someone for whom authority had always been a matter of proximity to the right people, rather than anything more formal. Her husband said nothing. And so it began. Celeste had a particular technique that I came to understand over the following months. She didn't attack directly. She didn't give orders that could be formally challenged. She worked through the softer, harder-to-document medium of implication. The way a sentence is constructed, the tone that runs underneath the actual words, the social impression created in front of an audience. At donor receptions, she introduced me the same way every time. "Oh, Paige handles all the little details for us," said warmly, said generously, said with a smile that communicated respect for a person who was very good at a modest supporting function. "She's extremely organized." This one delivered with a particular emphasis that makes a compliment sound like a ceiling, as if organized was the highest and most accurate description of what I was capable of contributing. The word "us" was always in there somewhere, carefully placed. The impression she created over dozens of conversations with donors and community partners and foundation stakeholders was clear and consistent. Celeste and her husband ran the foundation. I assisted them with the practical elements. Donors began treating me accordingly. Questions that should have come directly to my office were routed through Celeste first. People assumed she held authority over my decisions. She encouraged this, and her husband continued to say nothing about any of it. The donor dinner incident happened about 6 months after I first met Celeste. It was a private cultivation event, a small gathering for 12 of the foundation's most significant financial supporters. The kind of evening where relationships were built carefully, and where the atmosphere of trust and professionalism directly impacted whether donors renewed their commitments for the following year. I had organized everything: table setup, menu coordination, conversation seating designed around giving history and personal interests, program timing down to the minute. Celeste arrived early and spent the first 20 minutes working the room, when one of the longtime donors, a thoughtful man named Mr. Adeyemi, who had supported the foundation for 11 years, asked how things were running at the organization. Celeste gestured in my direction. "We're wonderful," she said. "Paige is the help. She keeps everything ticking along behind the scenes while the real work gets done." She said it lightly, casually, with a small laugh attached to it that invited everyone to share in the gentle joke. Mr. Adeyemi smiled politely. My chest burned. I excused myself to check on the catering and stood in the kitchen corridor for 30 seconds breathing slowly. Not because I couldn't handle it, but because it took real effort to keep the response I was forming inside my chest from reaching my face. I went back in, and I kept doing my job. 3 months before the gala, Celeste came to my office with a list. It was typed neatly, 10 names, a brief description beside each, and a note at the top that said addition to restricted donor event guest list. The restricted donor event was a small, board-approved gathering with a cap of 30 guests. Every attendee required advance clearance because the event involved confidential giving discussions and the review of named endowment options. All 30 approved spots were already filled. I looked at the list. None of the 10 names had been submitted through the proper board approval process. Several of them I recognized. Celeste's personal social contacts, people connected to her network, rather than to the foundation's donor community. I told her I couldn't add them without board approval. She looked at me the way someone looks at a door that has unexpectedly refused to open. "These are my guests," she said. "The event is at capacity and has a board-approved list," I said. "I'd be happy to submit an exception request on your behalf if you'd like." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in a very careful, quiet voice, "Remember who signs your paycheck page." I looked at her steadily. "The foundation board approves my contract," I said. "Not the executive director's office." She left without another word. The list was never formally submitted. What Celeste didn't know was that the board had already been watching. Not because of me, specifically. I had not gone to the board with personal complaints about her behavior. I had documented incidents in the operations log the way I documented every irregular event, and I had filed those reports through the standard channels without editorial commentary. Just dates, descriptions, outcomes. But the board had sources I wasn't aware of. Donor feedback. Staff reports submitted through the independent HR process. Financial review findings that had begun surfacing irregularities connected to events Celeste had been involved in managing. The board's governance committee had opened a quiet internal review several months earlier. I learned this only after it was already well underway. Briefed by the board president, Dr. Amara Osei Bonsu, during a meeting I thought was routine. "We want to make sure you understand the scope of what we're looking at," she said. She showed me a summary document. Unauthorized access to restricted foundation systems. Donor communications made without board knowledge or approval. Guest list manipulations at multiple events. Vendor contract discussions initiated without authorization. It was a comprehensive record. None of it had been hidden, exactly. It had just never been assembled into a single picture before. Seeing it all together, the pattern of it, the persistence of it, made the room feel very quiet for a long moment. The donor complaint arrived 6 weeks before the gala. It came in writing, a formal letter submitted to the board chair through legal counsel, which told you immediately that the donor had been advised by someone professional before sending it. The letter described a private meeting that had taken place between Celeste and the donor, a woman named Dr. Nadia Ford, who had been one of the foundation's most generous supporters for 8 consecutive years. In the meeting, Celeste had apparently suggested that Dr. Ford's continued access to the foundation's exclusive donor program would benefit from a more direct relationship with the executive director's family office. The implication of the letter was not subtle. Celeste had used the foundation's donor access system, the same system I managed, as leverage in a private conversation designed to benefit herself personally. That was not a governance issue. That was a legal one. Dr. Ford had not withdrawn her giving, but she had written the letter. And the board, once they received it, moved with a speed and seriousness that I had not seen from them in the previous 2 years. The investigation that had been quiet and internal became formal almost overnight. Auditors were engaged, external legal counsel was retained, board members who had been patient and watchful suddenly became urgent. Celeste continued appearing at foundation events with complete confidence. She had no idea how much had changed around her. The formal investigation ran for 5 weeks. I was interviewed twice, brief, professional sessions with the external legal team. They asked about specific incidents I had documented. They reviewed the operations logs I had been maintaining since Celeste first appeared in that boardroom 18 months earlier. They asked about the restricted event guest list incident, the donor dinner, the various attempts to redirect staff without authorization. I answered every question factually. I did not editorialize. I did not express opinions about Celeste as a person or speculate about her motivations. I simply described what had happened, when it had happened, and what documentation existed to support each account. The legal team thanked me each time and sent me back to work. Celeste continued walking through the building the way she always had. Designer clothes, confident posture, the particular ease of someone who has never seriously considered the possibility that the structure supporting them might not hold. She attended 2 smaller foundation events during the investigation period and behaved at both of them with complete normalcy, except for one exchange I witnessed where she told a new staff member that the board reported to her husband and her husband reported to her. I wrote that one down too. 5 weeks after it began, the investigation concluded. The board called an emergency closed session, and the night of the gala arrived. The emergency board meeting happened the morning of the gala, 8 in the morning. Closed doors, no staff present, no external guests, just the board, members, the legal counsel, and Dr. Osei Bonsu at the head of the table. I knew the meeting was happening. I did not know exactly what would be decided. I spent the morning doing what I had spent 4 months doing, running through the final checklist for the evening's event. Vendor confirmations, catering timelines, security briefings, audiovisual checks, donor registration verification, the program order, timed down to the minute. The gala had to happen regardless of what was being decided upstairs. 400 donors, a live auction with significant pledges expected, community partners and board members and press representatives. All of it was scheduled and arranged and depended on the evening running exactly as planned. I was at the registration desk reviewing the wristband system when Dr. Osei Bonsu came downstairs at 10:45. She walked directly to me. She was calm and composed in the way that people are calm and composed after making a decision they feel certain about. "The board completed its review this morning," she said quietly. "There are changes in effect as of today. I'll brief you fully tomorrow. Tonight, you need to know one thing." She looked at me steadily. "You have full operational authority for this event. That includes security. That includes removal authority." I stood at the registration desk for a long moment after Dr. Osei Bonsu walked away. Full operational authority. Security included. Those words landed differently than any instruction I had received before. Not because they were new. My role had always technically included operational authority over security staff during Foundation events. But in practice, that authority had spent 2 years being quietly undermined by the presence of someone who acted like she outranked every system in the building. I thought about what Dr. Osei Bonsu wasn't saying directly. If she was briefing me on security authority before an event where Celeste was expected to attend, the biggest event of the year, with 400 people watching, then the board was anticipating that Celeste would arrive tonight without knowing what had happened in that closed meeting. They were right. I spent the next 4 hours completing the final setup with my full team. Security briefings were handled carefully. I addressed the lead officer directly, confirmed the chain of command for the evening, and made sure every guard on the floor understood that all security decisions went through me. Not through any other party. Not through anyone claiming authority on behalf of the executive director. Through me. The lead officer confirmed everything clearly. The ballroom filled with flowers and light and the hum of a perfectly prepared event. And at 7:15, Celeste Rayner arrived. She came through the main entrance at 7:20. Designer gown, deep green, floor length, clearly chosen for a room this size and this audience. A small group of her personal guests surrounded her, none of them connected to the Foundation's donor community. She moved through the entrance hall with the ease of someone arriving at their own home after a long trip. Confident, unhurried, visibly pleased with the turnout. She stopped twice on the way to the VIP section. Once to greet a donor couple she had met at a previous event, once to say something to a board member who smiled and nodded with the careful neutrality of someone who knows things the other person doesn't. Guests admired her. She had that quality. The ability to fill a room. People gravitated toward her energy at events like this one, drawn by the confidence and the warmth she could produce on command, when the circumstances called for it. I watched from the operations station near the far wall. She hadn't spotted me yet. Then she turned. Our eyes met across the ballroom for one brief moment. Her expression shifted into the particular version of pleasant that she reserved specifically for me, warmer than dismissal, cooler than sincerity. "Oh good," she said, loud enough for the donor beside her to hear. "The staff showed up." The donor smiled. I forced a professional nod and turned back to my binder. The first 2 hours of the gala ran beautifully. Donor registration moved smoothly. The first auction items were well received. The catering team was perfectly timed. Conversations flowed naturally between guests who had been strategically seated near people they would find interesting. Everything I had spent 4 months building was functioning exactly the way it was supposed to function. Celeste circulated through the room with her personal guests, accepting compliments about the event, as if she had personally produced it. I watched this from a careful distance and said nothing, because tonight was not about my pride. Tonight was about protecting the foundation. Its reputation, its donor relationships, its capacity to keep doing the work it had been created to do. I kept my focus on the operations side, monitoring the program timeline, checking in with the catering lead, confirming the auction process was proceeding correctly with the evening's auctioneer. But I also watched Celeste. Because I knew her. I had watched her operate for over a year. And the particular quality of her energy tonight, the deliberate visibility, the performance of authority for the room's benefit, told me she had something planned. She wasn't simply attending this gala. She was building towards something. I didn't know exactly what form it would take. But I kept my binder close and my radio closer. It happened at 8:47. The program had been moving on schedule. The main auction segment was about to begin. The auctioneer was at the side of the stage preparing. The program coordinator was at the podium running through the brief introductory remarks that preceded the main segment. Celeste had been near the stage for the previous 20 minutes, positioned deliberately, visibly, in the sight line of donors who would naturally look toward the stage area. When the program coordinator paused to check her notes between remarks, Celeste stepped forward. She walked directly to the podium. She picked up the microphone, and she began speaking, smoothly, confidently, as if this had been scheduled and she had simply been waiting for her moment. She introduced herself. She described the foundation's history in terms that centered herself and her husband's stewardship. She thanked donors in a way that implied she had been responsible for their relationship with the organization. I watched from across the room as the program coordinator looked at me with wide, uncertain eyes. I moved toward the stage, not quickly, not dramatically, with the deliberate pace of someone who has the authority to do what they're about to do and doesn't need to rush to prove it. I stepped up beside the podium. "Celeste," I said it quietly enough that it didn't carry across the entire room, just far enough to reach her clearly. She turned. The microphone was still in her hand. Several nearby guests were watching now. The movement toward the stage had drawn attention. "The program has a scheduled timeline," I said. "The auctioneer is ready to begin." Her expression didn't change on the surface, but something behind it did. A quick recalibration, a rapid assessment of the audience, a decision made in roughly 2 seconds about how to manage this publicly. She smiled at the guests nearest to us. Then she leaned slightly toward me, just far enough that her next word stayed between us. "Stay in your lane, Paige," she said it warmly, like advice offered from a position of genuine concern. I held eye contact with her for one steady moment. Then I looked at the program coordinator and gave the small, clear signal we had discussed in the morning briefing. The one that meant the scheduled program was resuming now. The coordinator stepped toward the podium. Celeste held the microphone for exactly 3 more seconds. Then something shifted in her expression. The look of someone who has decided that a small correction needs a much larger response to properly establish the hierarchy for everyone watching. She turned away from the podium, she turned toward security, and she gave the order that changed the entire evening. Security. The single word landed in the middle of the ballroom like something thrown. Celeste didn't look at me when she said it. She looked past me, over my shoulder, toward the 2 security officers stationed near the far wall. Her posture was composed, her voice was completely steady. The glass in her other hand didn't move. "Drag her out." The room reacted before security did. Gasps from the guests nearest to it. A wave of silence moving outward from the stage area as conversations stopped and people turned to understand what they had just heard. Phones were raised, not all of them, but enough. I felt the air in the room change texture completely. She had made it public. Deliberately, carefully, in the biggest possible audience, on the Foundation's most visible night. This was the performance she had been building toward. The definitive, theatrical assertion of authority over the person she had been quietly undermining for 18 months. If it worked, every donor in that ballroom would leave tonight believing Celeste Rayner had the power to dismiss the operations director at a word. The two security officers stepped away from the wall. They walked toward the center of the ballroom. I stood completely still near the podium. My binder was in my hands. My heart was beating hard and steady, and I waited. The guards reached the center of the ballroom and stopped. Not slowed down, not hesitated. Stopped. Fully. Completely. Right there in the middle of the dance floor, with 400 donors watching and Celeste standing near the stage behind me, and the silence of the entire room pressing down on all of us. The two officers looked at each other briefly, then they looked at Celeste. Then they both turned and looked at me. The quality of that moment is very difficult to describe to someone who wasn't there. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies show dramatic things. Nobody moved suddenly. Nobody said anything loud. The music had faded out during Celeste's microphone interruption and hadn't resumed, so the silence was complete and real. The kind that makes small sounds enormous. I could hear the chandelier crystals moving faintly above us. I could hear someone near the back of the room exhale. Celeste frowned. The frown was small, controlled. The tiny adjustment of someone who expected a machine to produce a specific result and is trying to understand why it hasn't started yet. "What are you waiting for?" she said. Her voice was still steady, still authoritative, still the voice of someone who had not yet understood that the ground had moved. The lead security officer turned to face her and said something that stopped the room cold. "We can't do that." 4 words. Quiet, professional, without apology or aggression, just a clear, factual statement delivered by someone doing their job correctly. Celeste blinked. Not a dramatic reaction. A small, quick blink. The involuntary response of someone whose brain has just flagged an input that doesn't match expectations. "Excuse me?" she said. The lead officer, a steady, experienced man named Officer Wohl, who had worked Foundation events for 3 years, turned slightly and nodded in my direction. "We work for her now," he said. The silence that followed was the kind that carries actual weight. You could feel it pressing against the walls of the room. 400 people were holding completely still. Phones raised, eyes wide, processing what they had just witnessed. A security team had received an order from the executive director's wife and had turned and pointed at the operations director. 3 words that told every person in that ballroom everything they needed to know about where the authority in this building actually resided tonight. Celeste stood very still for what felt like a long time. The champagne glass in her hand had not moved. But the confidence behind her eyes, the absolute, architectural certainty of someone who had never genuinely expected to be refused, was cracking in a way that was visible from across the room. She looked at me. For the first time all evening, really looked at me. "That's ridiculous," she said. Her voice was still controlled, but the temperature had changed. Something harder and less polished was showing through the surface now, the way a structure shows damage when the outer layer gives way. "This is my husband's foundation," she said. "You work for his organization." "I work for the Halstead Civic Foundation," I said, "as its operations director, which my husband leads." "Which the board governs," I said. A movement near the side entrance of the ballroom caught my eye. Dr. Amara Osei-Bonsu was walking toward us, not rushing, not performing urgency, simply moving with the quiet certainty of someone who has decided it is time to be present. She reached the center of the floor. She looked at Celeste. She looked at the room, taking in the donors, the phones, the expressions on the faces of people who had been giving money to this foundation for years and were now watching something unfold that they didn't fully understand yet. She looked at me briefly, with the calm expression of someone confirming what they already know. Then she addressed the room. Not loudly. She didn't need to be loud in a silent room. "I want to be straightforward with everyone here tonight," she said. "The foundation has made some important leadership changes today. I'd like to explain." Every head in the room turned. Celeste's hand tightened on the champagne glass. Dr. Osei-Bonsu spoke for less than 2 minutes. She was precise and calm and said exactly what needed to be said, without elaboration or editorializing. The board had concluded a governance review that morning. Based on the findings, the executive director had been relieved of his position, effective immediately. The board had appointed an interim operational structure pending a formal executive search. Paige Talbot would serve an expanded operational authority during the transition period. She thanked the donors for their continued support. She assured them that the Foundation's programs would continue without interruption. She expressed confidence in the organization's future. Then she stopped speaking. The ballroom absorbed this information in the specific layered way that crowds absorb unexpected news. Some people immediately quiet, some people leaning toward neighbors to confirm what they'd heard, some people already pulling out phones to text someone the update. Celeste hadn't moved. She was standing near the stage where she had attempted to take the microphone 40 minutes earlier. Her guests, the personal group she had arrived with, were clustered nearby, and I could see from their faces that they were as unprepared for this moment as she was. Her husband had been removed. His position was gone, and with his position went every thread of authority that Celeste had woven around herself over the previous 18 months. She looked at me, and for the first time since I had known her, I could see that she finally understood. Dr. Osei Bonsu finished speaking and stepped back from the center of the room. She looked at me again, that same brief, certain expression, and gave me the nod that meant exactly what she had said it meant that morning. Handle it. My heart was beating with the steadiness of someone who has been preparing for a specific moment without knowing exactly when it would arrive. I turned to Celeste. The guests near her had taken a few small, instinctive steps back. Not dramatic, people simply creating a little distance when they sense that something needs space around it. Celeste's composure was still holding, but just barely. The way something holds when the force working against it has exceeded the threshold but hasn't quite finished its final push. "You need to go," she said quietly. "You're disrupting my husband's event." "Your husband is no longer the executive director," I said. "This is the Foundation's event, and it will continue on the scheduled program." Her jaw tightened. "You can't remove me." The words came out with less certainty than she had probably intended. "I have operational removal authority for this event," I said. "Granted by the board this morning. It applies to all guests and attendees." I looked at Officer Wool. He stepped forward. Celeste looked at him. At me. At the room full of watching faces. For the first time all evening, something in her expression shifted into territory that looked a lot like fear. She didn't scream. She didn't make a scene in the way I had seen people make scenes at events like this. She simply stood very still and said, in a voice that was almost a whisper, "You can't do this." "Yes," I said, "I can." I said it without satisfaction, without any particular emphasis. Just as a clear, factual statement in response to a clear, factual question. Officer Woolley positioned himself professionally beside her. Not touching, not threatening, simply present, the physical embodiment of the fact that the building's security was now oriented in a specific direction, and that direction was not hers. Her guests had moved further back. Two of them exchanged a look and quietly began gathering their things. Celeste looked at me one final time. The composure was gone now. What was left underneath it was something I recognized. The particular expression of someone who has spent years assuming the rules existed for other people, who has operated so consistently inside the protection of borrowed authority that the moment it disappeared, they genuinely didn't know how to stand without it. She was not a monster. She was a person who had never been told no by anyone with the actual power to make it stick. Tonight was the first time. I held the moment for exactly as long as it needed. Then I said, quietly and professionally, "I'll walk you out." We walked across the ballroom together. Not quickly, not theatrically, just two people moving through a room at a pace that allowed everyone present to understand clearly what was happening, without turning it into more of a spectacle than it had already become. We passed the auction display tables where donors had bid generously all evening on items that would fund the Foundation's youth programs. We passed the table where Dr. Ford, the donor who had written the letter that started the formal investigation, was seated. She watched us pass with an expression I couldn't fully read, though she gave me a single small nod that I understood as acknowledgement. We passed the stage where Celeste had stood with the microphone 20 minutes earlier, certain the room was hers. We passed the spot near the podium, where she had ordered security to drag me out. Celeste walked without speaking. Her guests had dispersed, some lingering awkwardly near the entrance, others simply gone. The front doors were ahead. I pushed one open and held it. The night air came in from outside, cool and quiet, the city moving steadily beyond the entrance steps. Celeste walked through the door without looking at me. The door closed behind her. I stood in the entrance hall for a moment. Then I turned around, walked back through the ballroom, picked up my binder, and returned to doing my job. 3 months after the gala, the board completed the executive search and announced a new director. 2 weeks before that announcement, they called me into a meeting and told me something I hadn't expected, or maybe had expected in the way that you sometimes know things are coming before they arrive, without quite letting yourself believe it. They were expanding the role of operations director into a full executive-level position. Executive Director of Operations. Broader authority. A seat at the leadership table. Direct board reporting for all operational functions. Osei Bonsu handed me the offer letter across the table. I looked at it for a moment. The staff who had spent 18 months quietly enduring Celeste's version of the foundation, managing her interference, absorbing her implications, deflecting her redirections with careful, patient professionalism. Those same people were now running the building with the kind of straightforward respect that should have been there all along. Small things changed. People came to work differently. The energy in the hallways was lighter. Decisions got made by the people responsible for making them, through the right channels, at the right times. I still think about the moment Officer Wohl stopped in the middle of the dance floor, 400 donors holding their breath. Celeste with her champagne glass. The silence before those 4 words, "We work for her now." Some people mistake confidence for authority. They fill rooms with presence and volume and the borrowed weight of someone else's title, and they mistake the silence of other people for agreement. But buildings run on systems. Organizations run on trust. And real authority was never something Celeste could order someone to carry out of a room. It was always already standing quietly at the podium, holding a binder.